There's this very bad characteristic of our tech landscape that it's actually easier to screw the world up with this tech than it is to stop it. My big fear is just that we're skewing more and more towards bad outcomes. We're literally walking into this trap as we think we're sort of innovating.
Welcome to our podcast. Today we have Dr. Erik J. Larson, AI scientist, tech entrepreneur, and author of The Myth of Artificial Intelligence. Erik also shares his insights on Collegio. His Substack launched in August of 2023, aiming to highlight issues in our data-driven world. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Erik J. Larson.
Well, thanks for having me.
Did I pronounce that properly, by the way?
Collegio. It's a double L. It's a Latin word, Colligo. Yeah, nobody knows how to pronounce it. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it means get people together to talk about the issues.
Right, get people.
It literally means get together. Yeah, gather together. Yeah.
So, given that your book, The Myth of Artificial Intelligence, was published in 2021, if you were to include an additional chapter in 2024, what would be the title and how would you modify the book's overarching thesis, particularly considering the release of ChatGPT in November of 2022?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I would add another chapter that was on generative AI. I'm not sure what I would title it yet, but something like the changes in our landscape from generative AI. What does it mean for the inference, for the book, the inference framework? And then what was the second part?
And then how would it change your overall thesis of the book, if at all?
So, yeah, this is the question. I get this frequently where people loved the book, and I had one guy, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I'm just saying it was because I sort of came out of this world where I wasn't a public figure at all. And then I wrote this book and Harvard picked up the contract. And I wrote this sort of book where it apparently spoke to a lot of, people who didn't know how to stop all the rhetoric about we're heading for the super smart AI that's going to take us over. But occasionally I do get people who read the book, but doesn't this sort of invalidate your argument? Or how do we think about this? How do we think about our AI in the age of ChatGPT, basically? And I think that's the central question to ask. People should ask that. But my answer is that my fundamental argument about the weaknesses in frequency-based approaches, which is the more data, the more intelligence, my fundamental argument is completely untouched. What did move the needle is that can be a lot more effective and powerful than we were thinking, the computer science community were thinking back in 2020, 2021. So I was actually working as a research scientist at a company here in Bryan College Station, and we were using the precursors, the foundational models, the precursors to ChatGPT. And so they were enormously effective, but they didn't have this kind of breakout feel like this is a new kind of phenomenon in the tech landscape. So I would have to cover that. It didn't change the fundamental argument, but it moves the needle. We can do quite a bit, it turns out, if you have huge amounts of data and really, if you have 25,000 GPUs and a ton of data, it turns out you can solve really seemingly difficult problems in NLP. So yeah, I would directly address that. And that sort of critique of ChatGPT is coming out. There are people who are talking about it, but they're using all kinds of different language. I would stick with the framework that I put out in the book, and I would explain how, to some extent that's flexible, but it's not breakable. If we don't have common sense or abductive reasoning, we really are not going to get to AGI. So yeah, that would be my angle on that.
I always read the reviews just out of curiosity. But a few of the reviews basically were like, well, with large language models, LLMs, ChatGPT, basically, his whole argument is proved invalid. And my thought was kind of like the contrary. I'm like, well, it actually kind of proves his argument because we've taken this massive step in AI. And I don't even really think AI is the right word. It's more just like big data. But the point is, to me, when I think of artificial intelligence, I'm thinking of something that has its own form of intelligence. I'm not thinking about something that is processing vast amounts of data that have been collected since the creation of the internet, between all the smartphone videos and all the web pages and the blogs. And it's just basically taking a prediction of the next word, running that back through the language model to give you the next prediction ad infinitum, basically. We had this massive step, but we're not really any closer. So I thought it actually proved the point anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same feel. So the failure points on that technology are just precipitous. They just drop off a cliff. In other words, when it works, it's amazing. But when it doesn't work, it can be actually a very simple question. It very quickly shows that the emperor has, no clothes. But that failure point is really bad. So if you try to translate that into medical science, right, to give expert advice for physicians and so on, you're going to have to really deal with this issue that most of the time you've got this bell curve for performance, but sometimes you have this complete nonsense. And by the way, I want to use the word bullshit every now. There's a really good article called The Technology of Bullshit, and it's really, really well written. And it gets into this problem. So there's two problems. The one I just mentioned is you have this precipitous drop off when you have a failure point, or when you just have a wrong answer, a false positive, right? It can be really, really crazy, and a human can look at it and it's a very, very simple problem to solve. It just didn't, for whatever reason, have the generate the right sequence of tokens for that to simulate the answer to that problem. And the second one is that the technology tends to dig in when it's wrong. So it's like the uncle that you have at the Christmas party that is saying something that is wrong, but the more you point it out, the more he or she, he digs in. And so the technology has this weird way that it won't correct itself. It's like the smartest person in the room that refuses to ever be wrong. And of course, there are situations where it will change course. But again, you could probably make this point number 3. We don't in general have any principled way of knowing when we have a failure, a false positive, a false negative, a false positive, or when we have a really good answer. There's no unprincipled way beforehand to tell what's going to happen. I get these discussions where someone who said, well, I interacted with it and it said, oh, very good point, and it changed its answer. And my response to that is absolutely. And you'll get that kind of behavior from the system, but you'll also get, and I've done this on GPT-4 myself, not just Googling responses. You'll also get this confabulation where it just refuses. It just refuses. I had it once. I was working with it on symbolic logic and it was doing quite well. And at some point though, it got turned around, which means it's generating frequency tokens to complete the prompt. It actually knows, it doesn't know what's going on. But at some point there was a hole in its training data and it started insisting that A and not A were both true. It was the most fundamental, it's called the law of the excluded middle, but it's the most fundamental knowledge that we have. And a 4-year-old understands that you can't be both in the store and in the car driving to the bank. So when you look at that, you know that we have a system that has impressive generative performance, but we don't have any way of evaluating its errors, and its errors can be profound. And it can also not correct its errors, even when multiply, it can, prompted. So yeah, the whole spectrum of that has to be taken into account when we think about the technology.
This brings me up to an interesting point where I watched you in one of your other podcasts, and the host asked you if AI, ChatGPT, will learn from its mistakes. And you brought up Tom Cruise's mom, where you ran, who is Tom Cruise's mom, through ChatGPT, and then it told you the answer was Mary Lee Pfeiffer. But then when you asked ChatGPT who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer, it told you it didn't know. And this was 5 months ago. And I watched this today, so I was like, I'll try it. So I tried it in both Gemini and in ChatGPT, and you're 100% right. Neither Gemini nor ChatGPT knew. And when I asked ChatGPT, it changed the name to, it says Tom Cruise's mother is Mary Lee Pfeiffer. Then I said, who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer? It says, I apologize for the confusion in my previous response. I made an error in providing information. Mary Lee Pfeiffer is not Tom Cruise's mother. Tom Cruise's mother's name is Mary Lee South. So then I said, are you sure? And it's I apologize for the confusion. There's no widely held information about Mary Lee Pfeiffer. you said it would be fixed probably, and 5 months later, it's still not, though, is my point.
So what was, I'm sorry to have to repeat, but like, what was the first question you asked it again? Because I want to follow up on this, but how did you word it?
So I went with what you said. So who is Tom Cruise's mom? It says Tom Cruise's mother is Mary Lee Pfeiffer. Then I said, who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer?
Yeah. So the point there is, from a very early age, we understand that we can actually reverse things. So if I'm the father of so and so, she's the daughter of me, right? Like we just understand how language works. It's not just the meanings of the words, it's the underlying logical structure that those things are substitutable. And it doesn't get that. It just doesn't. It's very obvious that technology just doesn't know that. So you've got to do prompt engineering. You've got to figure out, which is why I asked you again, like, how did you put it exactly? Because if you put it a slightly different way, it might get it right. And I get all the time, again, just, I'm not trying to harp on this point, but because to be honest with you, 99% of the feedback I get is still very supportive of the idea that we're not on a path to AGI. But people, I think, are confused on this point, and I'm doing my best to sort of straighten it out. They will say, well, I asked it that, you can always change the prompt to get the right answer. And that is a solution in a problem in disguise, because then you're putting on the user how to engineer the prompt so that you can manipulate the technology to give you a correct answer. If you're a doctor, if possibly even if you're an attorney, you don't want to be in the business of prompt engineering to get back the right information. You want to know sort of like how that technology works, when it fails, when can I expect it to fail? And we don't have that data. We just don't have that information. So yeah, that's a perfect example of it not having what we call a world model, like not a fundamental understanding of how objects interact in space and time.
I've been having fun with the various AI tools. I run this podcast and I used various tools for editing and for descriptions and finding B-roll and things like that. So I'm not like a Luddite. Most people are not. The problem that I have is where people basically think we're going to go from Chat GPT to like Skynet or to Ava and Ex Machina or something like that. And I was reading an article from Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, aka Chat GPT and Dolly. And in this March 2021 article, he says, quote, in the next 5 years, computer programs that can think will read legal documents and give medical advice. In the next decade, they will do assembly line work and maybe even become companions. And the decades after that, they will do almost everything, including making new scientific discoveries that will expand our concept of everything. And he has everything in quotes. Later on in the same article, he says that the price of many kinds of labor, which drives the cost of goods and services, will fall towards zero once sufficiently powerful AI joins the workforce. And the world will change so rapidly and drastically that an equally drastic change in policy will be needed to distribute this wealth and enable more people to pursue the life that they want. It's the end of this quote. And so this came out in March of 2021. This is basically 3 years old. And I don't even think we're on track to reach the goals of his first 5 years. I don't think you're going to any doctor and getting medical advice with AI right now. I don't think we're even close to any of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So just full disclosure, I'm involved in a startup. I know, like, I'm trying to explain this to my readers. Like, why are you on both sides of this? And I'm not, actually. I really welcome the opportunity to come on and talk about it. But I'm actually involved with a startup where we expand access to LLMs in scenarios where they don't have anything else. So let's say you're forwardly deployed as a doctor in a battle zone in the military, and you're trying to make it a very fast diagnosis and keep somebody alive. It might be helpful to have a handheld that you can ask questions to, right? So we might actually want to push AI technologies in scenarios where you just don't have better options. The medical field is particularly germane to this because there are situations where you don't have a lot of time and you don't have access to, 20 doctors that you can talk to for, right? Like, you're not in a hospital, you're not at Johns Hopkins, you're somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And so I do think like this is how I try to explain it, that it's not going away. It just isn't. And it's already ruining the internet. There's a fantastic article today I was looking at about how we writers published authors are in jeopardy because people are feeding the manuscripts of newly published books. And then you get back so many different links, how-tos, and, so-and-so for dummies. And it's all BS. Like, there's nobody behind it. But our content as writers is getting buried by generative AI. So I'm very profoundly ambivalent about it. But nonetheless, and challenge me on this if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think it's a technology that's going to be buried or superseded, for a while. Like, we don't have anything on the horizon that's better in natural language processing. And it doesn't seem like there's going to be enough force from copyright infringement and other sort of pushbacks, right, to be able to sort of like take it out of the equation. So what do? We try to make it better. We try to inform the public on how it works. We try to deploy it when it's deployed in areas where it actually has a chance of doing some help. And so I'm involved in that, as wearing my sort of entrepreneur's hat, but I don't see the contradiction in doing that and also pointing out why this technology has dangers and where those dangers are. But there are a lot of people who just wish that we could push a delete button. I'm probably one of those, by the way, but practically speaking, we can't. It's not going to go away. Just one final point to just sort of a bridge on top of this is that all the major big tech companies have their own internal models now. Amazon has a large language model. They're using it for Alexis. Remember the Alexis service, conversational AI, obviously Gemini and Google and so on. But like pretty much everyone that has deep pockets in that big tech space, they all are using this technology now to improve customer service and so on. So how are we going to sort of like pull that back? How are we going to, yeah.
Was the thing last week, Google recently paused their image generation capability in their Gemini model, admitting that it was tuned, in air quotes, resulting in unintended accuracies. And then it makes people wonder how this affects their algorithm when you're actually searching on Google, because it highlights the biases that they might have. But for every step that ChatGPT or Google Gemini or AI has taken, there's also, they've had setbacks along the way. And so this has only been released in November 2022 with ChatGPT, so it hasn't been that long. But we're clearly seeing that there's a lot of issues with it. And then you're wondering, do you really want to have ChatGPT or Google Gemini making really important decisions? And then that doesn't even get to the point of self-driving cars and things like that.
It's hard to draw a circle around everything to talk about with this tech because there are so many concerns, cultural and social. I mean it. And one of them is, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this. This is coming from my friend. It's just, this stuff is so inherently incendiary, you can't even talk about it. But apparently he was on Gemini and he was trying to get a picture of George Washington, and it was coming out with different, skin color. And it's like, look, I'm very, very open-minded about that. Actually, like, this is sort of a non sequitur, but my ex-wife is actually African-American. It's like, okay, but like, that's just ridiculous. George Washington, And so the thing is, if you look at the provenance of that model, somebody probably in the stage where they're training it, so the models they're interacting with it internally, so they're getting answers and then they're scoring them using reinforcement learning. Somewhere in there, somebody was clicking something that skews our knowledge of historical facts and so on, right? And I'm sure they're doing it for all the right motives, but the end result is we're showing falsehoods. We're showing misinformation in stuff that actually really matters. And so the potential and danger for bias in these models is huge. It's impossible for a tech company with a bunch of, nerd engineers, right, to make these decisions about what's true and false in the world. It's just impossible to do that. That's a discussion that we need to have.
I was watching that as well, where they were basically like, show an image of the founding fathers, and not a single one of the founding fathers was white. And then it was like, show us an image of Nazi soldiers, and it was like black and Asian soldiers. And then it was like, show us an image of popes, and every pope was some like ethnic female. You can have your own political biases all you want, but if you're trying to get down to factual information, you're just factually wrong.
That's right. And we have this kind of epistemological crisis, I think, today, where, I hear all the time somebody gives me a conspiracy theory. I have friends to the left of center. I have friends to the right of center. I grew up in Spokane. My family are all very to the right of center. But occasionally I'll hear a conspiracy theory and it just strikes me as that's not right. It could be on the left, it could be on the right, but that information is not correct. Where did you get that? Right. And we're losing our ability. There's just a silence. Like I read it on this website. Well, how do you know that website? And we're losing our ability to basically keep track of the set of things that are true and the set of things that are false. And there are edge cases that we argue, but there are certain things that are just manifestly absurd. On the face of it, it's just that's an absurd position. And then I see really smart people taking absurd positions. And I don't want to throw bombshells here, but that would be the end of democracy, because the entire idea is that we have access to the information. We can find out what's true and what's false, and then we can make an informed decision about who we want representing us, in Congress, in the House and Senate, and obviously for president. And so I'm seeing that sort of just drift away, and it's doing it like I think I was overseas for 2 years. I left in 2017. I went to just travel. I lived in Ukraine for a while, for a couple of years, but I was traveling constantly. And I came back from 2017. I came back in 2019 and the country was totally different. I wasn't plugged into, Twitter. I wasn't plugged into Instagram, Facebook, any of the social media stuff. I was really just taking a break from the US and traveling. And when I came back, it seemed like half the world was crazy. Everybody was arguing. It's like somebody had put something in the water or something. So I think it's a huge problem. And getting back to the point about generative AI is probably exacerbating this problem, probably almost certainly exacerbating rather than resolving it. That's something we have to really take seriously.
In your Substack, since we mentioned it at the beginning, you had an article, and I forget what the name of it was called, but people can go to your Substack and check it out. But basically, you start out by saying that LLMs, or large language models, are a disruptive technology, but they're not yet feasible for many companies and organizations. And then you write later, quote, that training GPT-4 took 25,000 GPUs, or about 3,125 servers, and 90 to 100 days of continuous runtime. This means that if you want to fix the boat, in air quotes, by training a new model, you'll have to get your hands on a few $1 billion and a few thousand GPU servers and wait over 3 months while you watch the electric bill grow by orders of magnitude. And anyway, given the lack of a world model, the fix will make some things better perhaps, but won't touch the underlying frailty of the approach. Is this really a path to AGI, to superintelligence? I think not. Scott Galloway, who is a centimillionaire investor, professor of marketing and whatnot, I heard him in a podcast like 4 months ago say that we hit peak AI. To your article, what was your overarching principle with that?
In that article, I was trying to highlight the fact that what we now call AI doesn't start in a garage. I actually have the dubious honor, because it means I'm old, but I actually started January of 2000 at an AI company. It's a company in Austin called Psycorp, and we were building this big knowledge base. And that was the old symbolic approach to intelligence. That's how I started out. But I make the joke that the entire century I've been involved in AI, because I started January 2000. But back in the 2000s, you could get a couple of friends to this is basically what Zuckerberg did, by the way. Get a couple of friends together, get some resources from your university server, or just rent some server space and start a completely new company. And now we're in this corporate bureaucratic mode where if you want to even be in the game of AI and not be a consumer, but actually be, someone who produces AI and pushes the field forward, you've got to be a billionaire. What happened from garage startups, right, to billionaires? So there's a sense in which we did this huge loop with the World Wide Web, and we had this sort of power to the people idea. And within 2 decades, we're kind of back in, business as usual. Big companies squeezing out little guys and appropriating for themselves the word AI. It just means 25,000 GPUs and a few $1 billion. in 3 months, right? So I mean, I like that's not. There's no. There's no. Well, there's a problem. We don't have a clue what else would produce the performance of generative systems right now. That is a problem. But to my knowledge, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think we're even putting R&D dollars into something else that might work. It's just like the world is kind of in this conformist mode. And just whatever the big tech folks say is what's happening. This is AI. And I think that's dangerous. It's inherently dangerous to have that going on. So I think that's why I wrote the piece. No garage startups anymore. I think that was the idea. Yeah.
Do you think Scott Galloway is correct with his thought that 3 or 4 months ago that we did hit peak AI?
No, I think that's a completely. Oh, did he? Was he saying that because we're not going to be able to get more training data and so on? Is he saying that we've leveled?
Yeah, basically we've leveled.
Yeah, actually, that debate will get resolved based on what computer scientists right now are doing. They're testing so-called synthetic data, which is data generated by a machine, and they're seeing if they can get learning curves, performance curves from synthetically generated data like they would from newly human, discovery of new human generated data. If that turns out to be the case, and I'm pretty sure, I wouldn't bet the farm on it, but I would bet quite a bit it's going to be false because you're in a loop, right? Like you can feed it, you can have one, system generate the content with a different set of parameters. Let's be more creative, and then give it to another system, large language model. But at the end of the day, I think what we're going to discover, just as a point in computer science, is that we have plateaued in terms of we hoovered up all the human data, and we're not going to be able, like, I think even Sam Altman said, GPT-5 is not coming anytime. GPT-5 is not coming anytime soon. And I think the reason is that it's not cost effective to build a model that's going to take 3 months to train. It's going to take billions of dollars of infrastructure. And we don't know the output because a lot of the humans aren't generating new content fast enough to keep up with the curve of GPT-5, GPT-6, and so on. So I think Scott is right about that. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's very unclear how we're going to have any major step from where we are forward. We might have incremental steps. We can break models into smaller domains. So you could have a model just for movie recommendations. And it might or might not outperform the big models. Llama 2 from Facebook, that's open source. It's a big model. It took billions to train. Obviously, the OpenAI's GPT and Gemini. But, we might be able to get performance by specialization. But I think the era of just straight up large language models is pretty much over. Yeah, I think I can't see how we're going to have the data basically to make a substantive performance improvement over what the state of the art is right now. Yeah, that's right. I think he's right. Yeah.
Basically, with ChatGPT, we've had a couple decades of massive amounts of data from the internet. And then the microprocessor chips have just gotten so much better. And then, of course, OpenAI has billions of dollars of money. Right now, there's only one advanced chip company in the world, and that is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or the TSMC. And I think there's probably reasons why the U.S. is always going to be in a relationship with Taiwan because of the semiconductor plant. But a few years ago, they spent like $40 billion building a couple plants in Arizona, and they're having major setbacks. They're having to put more money into it. They're saying that people in the U.S. don't have the skill set to even do this job. And I think everyone is probably familiar with Gordon Moore's first law, which is basically that the number of transistors on a microchip roughly double every 2 years. But I don't think people are very familiar with Moore's second law, sometimes called Rock's law, which basically states that the cost of building a semiconductor fabrication plant doubles roughly every 3 or 4 years. There's only one plant in the entire world that can build was it a 3 nano microprocessor chip? So if they're already at what, a 40-50 billion dollar plant, the next one is going to be $100 billion. And I've read studies that said Moore's law has been dead since like 2014, 2015, something like that, basically a decade ago. It leads me to believe that we're probably not going to see a whole lot of advancements if we're just looking at straight A power and B data. And I think that was one of the major points of your book, even before ChatGPT came out.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So this fact is not known well enough by the public, what you just said. And you're absolutely 100% true. So if you look at Moore's law, it was impressively correct since 1960, what was it, 65, I think?
Came out in 1965, yeah.
Yeah, it was basically correct until, just like you said, until about 2015, 2014. And then basically it's not true anymore. So it hasn't been true for almost a decade, like Moore's law. But everybody keeps using this idea that we're on this rocket ship. It's like, well, we're not on a rocket ship if like Moore's law was underpinning all that confidence, basically. We're always going to have a faster and faster computer. But as you point out, I think this is a really important point. We're not going to have a faster computer if it takes an order of magnitude more money and then 2 orders of magnitude more money to build it, right? You're looking at a non-starter in a cost-benefit analysis. It's just a non-starter. And so I think we're at the end of an era, but many people are misreading the tea leaves and thinking we're at the beginning of an era. And we're actually at the end. We need a fundamental discovery that's going to actually be able to change the landscape. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
I always like to read some quotes from books. I kind of mark them down as I read these books. This is one of my favorite quotes from your book. And you touched on one thing that I agree with, which is this anti-human component. And you write, quote, Crowellians and Russellians alike promulgate a technocentric view of the world that both simplifies views of people, in particular, with deflectionary views of intelligence as computation, and expands views of technology by promoting futurism about AI as science and not myth. Focusing on bat suits instead of Bruce Wayne has gotten us into a lot of trouble. We see unlimited possibilities for machines, but a restricted horizon for ourselves. In fact, the future intelligence of machines is a scientific question, not a mythological one. If AI keeps following the same pattern of overperforming in the fake world of games or ad placement, we might end up at the limit with fantastically intrusive and dangerous idiot savants.
Which is not a bad way.
Excuse me. I gotta say, dangerous idiot savants.
Yes, which is actually not a bad way to describe large language models, right? But just to be fair here, I'll add some criticism here to myself. We were focused on games because at the time, the most impressive performances we had were not in natural language processing. They were actually in playing complicated board games like Go and so on. And it turns out that NLP, which is my area, natural language processing, it turns out that we had a significant jump forward in performance from LLMs, large language models. But the problem is that we already had a narrative in culture and society that people are kind of just bad versions of computers. And if you look at all the literature coming out of psychology and cognitive science and these kind of cognate fields, they're always pointing out how we're full of bias. There's the political bias and so on. And then there's the bias, confirmation bias, right? Like we're always jumping to the wrong conclusions. We can't be trusted. Our brains are very, very, very yesterday's tech, so to speak. And so if you have this message going on and then you're generating, like let's just use the term idiot savant, right? You don't have any path to innovation. Like you're closing off the path to innovation. You're telling people sit and wait. You're literally telling our Einsteins, wherever they are today, sit and wait. And you're by simultaneously cheerleading for a technology that has major flaws. And so there's no path to innovation. And I actually think this is and people, when I say this, like I don't necessarily, I say it online, I write it so I don't see their faces, but I imagine their jaws dropping. I think this is one of the least innovative times in the last, right? Like the arguably the 2000s innovated with Web 2.0, But the last decade is one of the least innovative times that we've had in a long time. And it's sort of dangerous that everybody thinks the opposite. If people said, wait a minute, we're just doing tweaks to neural networks, we're just doing extensions to existing technology. Yes, we're making progress, but we're doing it at the expense of massive amounts of funding, massive amounts of energy consumption, right? This is not really, this is the Cadillac in 1950 that we went over. We finally went over 120 miles an hour, but you can't get around the corner because the suspension doesn't work and the brakes and so on. And so I'm just worried that nobody is taking up the torch to say what's actually better than what we have. And there's this acquiescence. I see conformity everywhere. Like, I just wish there were digital beatniks out there that would say, well, you're probably, it seems like you're one of them. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah. It's something that if things keep me up at night, that's one of them. Like, where are we headed? This question of where are we headed? And in AI, I think we've got a closed box system right now. Like, nobody's going to be innovating as long as this stuff is still, I mean, look at me. Like, I literally am getting involved in a startup that's expanding access to LLMs, not to the public where it's going to be dangerous, but in very constricted domains where it might actually have a benefit. That's all I'm willing to do. And if it doesn't have a benefit or we make more problems, then I'm going to be exit stage left out of that effort.
It goes back to what you mentioned earlier about the startup in the garage. These big tech companies basically at this point hold all the keys. They hold all the power. Right now, with all the processing power, you got to have billions of dollars. That was the whole point of the internet when it came out, right? It was supposed to be democratized. It was for anyone. And now it's more concentrated. And I know that you talk about kind of bureaucracy. Actually, in your book, you talk about the book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And I've always seen it on list. So I actually read it. It's one of my favorite books now. I was like, well, if this Erik guy recommends it, eventually I'll read to it. So I actually read it. It's one of my favorite books. But you talk about, it's like the bureaucracy. Obviously, it's, it takes place, communism. And I feel like we've reverted back to where we're basically, the whole point of the internet was to be decentralized. And it's so centralized. It's so bureaucratic. And why would you trust AI anyways, even if we were able to reach some AGI?
Yeah, right. So I think the idea from the sort of Nick Bostrom folks, the super intelligence folks, I think the idea is that if it reaches a certain level of intelligence, then kind of ipso facto, like by that fact alone, by it having this advanced intelligence, it also has the ability to potentially misalign with us, make decisions that are not in our best interest and so on. And sort of what's underlying that is this idea that once you get smart enough, you also become a thing. And that's just not true. Like, a calculator is extremely good at arithmetic. Like, no one can beat a calculator on the face of the planet, And so, but like, that doesn't, by that fact, it doesn't mean that your calculator has feelings about how it's treated and so on. And so in a sense, there's just a huge glaring error, philosophical error that's being made by the superintelligence folks, the existential risk folks, which is that you're going to somehow increases in performance, machine performance are going to equal this kind of thing quality where it decides to, do something. And that's wasted energy in my view. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is, like, very bad actors are going to use very powerful machines to screw everything up, right? Like, that's the real danger. The existential risk is that like Putin or someone, I don't want to, get into politics, but like somebody gets control of these systems and directs them towards ruining Wall Street, ruining the markets, right? Bringing down the power grid. That's a big threat. The machines themselves, I think we can, I'm very confident, and I would bet the farm that they're not going to make the leap from being faster and calculating more complicated problems to being alive in any sort of sense, or having any kind of motivations or something that could misalign like that. That's the sci-fi vibe that's getting pushed into a scientific discussion.
People are negative by human nature, and it's probably a survival mechanism. Like, if you see a lion in the savannah and you're just like, it's going to be fine, you're probably dead. But if you're like, maybe that lion's trying to like murder my ass, maybe you like
Yeah.
get out of its way. I actually read the book Future Babel, which you referenced in your book, and it made me think of the Kurzweil. How do you pronounce the guy's name again?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kurzweil, where the guy who's always talking about the singularity, and he said the singularity will happen in 2029. And in your book, you say, quote, "The singularity, this is the crossover point where machines and not people take over as the most intelligent beings on the planet," which is basically what his theory is. And it's like, first off, one, I don't know why these people would want that. I had a recent podcast where I had a professor at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and we were talking about sex robots. And when I was doing all this research on these sex robots, they were more concerned about the rights of the sex robot than they were about the human. And then when I was talking with this professor, she was saying, like, I forget what year it was. It might have been like 2014, but there was a conference in Austria where some people basically abused one of the sex bots. Really, was more like a sex doll at this conference. And then people wanted these people charged with, and then I asked her, what do you think? Should they have been charged with? And she's like, well, I don't think so because it didn't quite have feelings. But then she's like, I even feel bad for saying this. And I'm thinking, like, this at best is a property crime. But why are we already like trying to give robots more rights than people? Like you mentioned, that kind of this anti-human component. And even who was the professor in 1964 that invented ELIZA? You mentioned him in the book. Yeah. Right. I mean, and he was already worried about this in the 1960s. Like, wasn't his secretary closing the door on him so she could spend more time talking to the chatbot, like?
Yeah. Yeah. I've noticed our psychology, full disclosure, I use GPT-4 in constrained contexts where I have an expectation of getting a better result than not using it. And like every now and then, just for fun, I'll say like, thanks, I really appreciate that. And it will say something back human, like, you're welcome. If I can be any more help to you, Erik, please let me know. I don't know if it uses my name, but it says something very sort of human. And so I think that sort of performance, that sort of way of interacting with the machine just messes with our minds. We just don't know how to deal with things that show outward signs of empathy. And so our brains basically want to just attribute to those responses that there must be something behind it. And the dirty little secret is there's nothing behind it. We're in a brave new world where you can have these kind of empathetic responses. But it is the same phenomenon that Joseph Weizenbaum, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the computer scientist, with ELIZA, like it's the same phenomenon that he was pointing to in the 1960s that's just resurfaced in this modern guise. So we just keep making the same kind of errors basically in how we think about tech, but there's so much more tech in the world today that I think the stakes are a lot higher. In 1960, you could sort of escape this problem. And many did, like the Back to Earthers and so on, right? And 2024, like it's unclear that you can get away, at all from our tech landscape. So I think the stakes are a lot higher today.
I was reading a book in preparation for this podcast as well. I forget the name of it, but it was written by George Johnson, whose probably most famous book is The Cancer Chronicles, which is a great book. But anyways, he basically, I think this book came out in 1986 and he's talking about AI. So we're talking like almost 40 years ago. But his kind of dilemma was he felt that AI, everything that they were trying to do was compared to humans. This is back when he was talking to Minsky and a lot of the original AI researchers at the 1956 conference in Dartmouth. But they were trying to make people more like machines, and talked about even just a lot of the words, like if you're homeless, it's like, oh, you just need to be reprogrammed because it's just a bug in the system. Like we can just reprogram you. Or if you're violent, we can just reprogram you. We don't even know how nutrition works in the body. Like people can't even decide on that. We somehow know how consciousness works and how it's ridiculous. Of course we don't.
Yeah. I agree. I think there was, the story is, if you remember the guy behind cybernetics, I'm blanking on his name now. Wiener, his last name is Wiener. He was a really famous mathematician, and he started a movement in the United States called cybernetics. And it stems from a Greek word that means steer the ship, right? And so cybernetics was this is I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but one of the guys at the Dartmouth conference actually disliked Wiener and wanted to distance himself from cybernetics and come up with a new term. So they came up with artificial intelligence to separate it from cybernetics. And I think like that right there, just like, I don't want to be too reductionistic, but calling it intelligence was one of the first really bad ideas, right? Because it just creates a space in your mind to think about it in a flawed way perpetually, right? Thinking about it in terms of cybernetics, where you're steering something and you're trying to use technology and tools to get to a place or get to a result, I think is much more healthy. But by the way, one of the underpinning ideas of cybernetics was not, as in with AI, AI is sort of like the machine can have a mind. But what cybernetics was committed to was, and it's equally, I mean, it's the same problem, but it's a different focus, is that like the human brain is a machine, right? The mind is a machine. And so like, I think like so this is cybernetics, like was complicit in, in like this computational theory of mind, clearly. But I think like once you get to believing that we're just a complicated machine, then all the nuts and bolts of the super intelligence folks fall into place. If we're just a complicated machine, then it stands to reason that at some point we'll have a more complicated machine. It's just a continuum, and we're on that. But if you actually remove that premise and say, look, we're not machines, we're not computers, we just aren't, then you have an ability to talk about human culture in a way that can actually be healthy. We think differently, we reason differently, we have superior aspects to our behavior and performance, and we actually do care and have motivations about how things turn out, unlike the tools we use. And so, yeah, I'm fascinated in this intellectual history way of how we ended up here with these. But just let me just add this also, this kind of idea that science can create a monster has been going on for a long time. Mary Shelley wrote that famous manuscript of Dr. Frankenstein back in, I think it was like, 1820 or something. And it wasn't AI, but it was this idea that we can create life out of the powers of our new science. And so I think like that idea, it reaches further back in time than cybernetics and AI, but our latest version of it is particularly difficult to talk about because it's everywhere. It's like AI is everywhere. So, yeah.
If you had a child, a senior in high school, and they're looking at different colleges, different universities that they're going to go to, like what major would you steer them to? Would you steer them toward a trade school, certain majors? Basically, I guess the question is, I think people always have this fear of how is this going to impact my job or impact how I make money, pay my mortgage, etc. in the future. So take us through maybe the next 10 years of how you would give your child advice and set themselves up for the next decade or so.
Well, that's a hard question to answer. There is a question that has appeared relatively recently, which is like, should you even bother with higher education if it's in such a mess? Are there other options to becoming educated? And so I think that might actually enter into it. And that would have been unthinkable for me even 20 years ago. I had a really high degree of confidence in the educational system in the United States. I did a PhD at the University of Texas. And it was, it wasn't easy. There were really smart people that were ensuring that you learned everything you needed to learn before you could get that honorific. And I'm not sure that's at all true today. So the one question would be, is that the only option, going into higher education? And that's a really sad commentary, by the way, that you would tell your children. My children they're in their 20s. And so I don't have to have that discussion anymore. So data science is basically what's dominating the white collar world right now. And that means anyone who understands how to manipulate a large data set for an organization and turn it into value one way or the other is going to be highly paid. That's definitely a fact of our, employment situation right now. But the thing, and I don't know if this has anything to do with AI, but this is just like, I've always believed, I heard a music instructor. I was a musician when I was much, much younger. And I was trying to figure out, should I keep playing classical piano or should I play sports? And do what what are you good at that no one else is good at or very few people are good at, right? And so people should be guided by their unique qualities. And for some, that's a lot easier because something just jumps out. You're really, really gifted in something, and then your path is fairly obvious. For other people, they may have many, many different talents. You might have academic talents, intellectual talents, physical talents. But the marketplace that we're in right now, you're either, there's all the, like, this is getting into economics, but all the jobs that we used to have at sort of this mid layer, what we used to call the middle class, have either pushed up into really high inflated salaries, or they've pushed down into the service industry where you're in the gig economy and you're doing, something like that. And so there's a sense in which, with all this diversity in, everywhere, we actually have limited options. We have less limited options now, right? If you're not going to study data science, it kills me to say this, but if you're not going to be aware of, at some level, data science, you're kind of putting yourself an advantage in the next 10 years. But I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how that's going to change. But almost nothing in AI, like almost no industry, is not touched by data science, which I think of as a somewhat broader umbrella than AI. It's just basically manipulating data for value. Though the whole world is driven on data now. Like, we even have people calling dataism our new metaphysics, right? And so if you don't know sort of how to manipulate with machines data, manipulate data with machines, you're just automatically at a disadvantage. And there's nothing wrong with driving, for Uber or so on, but it's not the same economic opportunity. So the economy is going to have to do something with that. There's going to have to be more opportunities, for people. There's a double problem. Let me just rehash really quickly here. The first problem is, I think we're losing confidence in higher education to actually give us that sort of broad, education that makes us able, that fosters the ability for us to choose what we want and be successful. I think higher education is becoming something else that's not helpful to educate people. And the second point is, we have this kind of thing going like this for jobs at the top, where there's less and less jobs that don't have anything to do with data science. And so when you're in that sort of situation, I can't imagine how the kids today feel about their futures, but there's high levels of anxiety and depression, especially with teen girls. And it's somewhat of a crisis, honestly, but it's outside my pay grade. Like, I'm not exactly sure how the economy is going to work out, but I'm not particularly optimistic myself. I don't see anything that changes our fundamental problem right now. So, yeah.
What is your biggest fear right now about AI?
Destroying the information space that we need to make informed decisions. I think the generative AI is one example of this, but it reaches back, I think, a little further. But big data, I call it big data AI, is very, very good at doing things that we don't want. It's a technology that's very powerful at solving problems that we want solved, but it also lends itself far too easily to bad actors. So, if you're in possession of what is it called, the competition where you build a deep fake, I can't remember the name of the algorithm, right? But where you make a deep fake. Like, if you're in possession of the generative adversarial networks, if you have access to a GAN and some space on a cloud server or something, and you just want to mess with people, you want to disrupt an election, you want to disrupt, anything, you can make images that are increasingly realistic, and the attempts to stop them lag behind. So there's this very bad characteristic of our current tech landscape, that it's actually easier to screw the world up with this tech than it is to stop it. And so my big fear is just that we're skewing more and more towards bad outcomes. And so we're literally walking into this trap as we think we're sort of innovating. And I just think, like, that's not true of AI necessarily across the board, but it's true of data-driven AI. It's true of data-driven AI. And so every time we have an election, we're going to have a scandal that involves technology now. I guarantee it. So that's my biggest fear, is just that we're losing ground against the tech being used for malicious and nefarious purposes. And it's kind of baked into the tech that it's able to do all this stuff. The very thing that gives you the image and you go, wow, that's cool, gives you the politician saying something that they didn't actually say. It's the same tech, you know? So yeah, I'm worried about that very much so.
So today's guest has been Dr. Erik J. Larson, author of the book, The Myth of Artificial Intelligence, Why Computers Can't Think the Way That We Do. So Erik, I know you got to get out of here pretty soon, so I got 2 final questions for you. Just let people know where they can find you on Substack, find your book, all that stuff. And then just secondly, just leave us with a final thought.
Well, you can get my book from Amazon, The Myth of Artificial Intelligence. You can Google it. If you want to learn about me, you have to put the J in my name so you don't get the fiction out. But by the way, that's really good fiction. And then my Substack, I'm putting a lot of effort into that. I just released it in September, but it's growing, daily, basically. So that's Colligo. It's Colligo. And a lot of the things we were discussing, I take up in pieces for the sub. And then the final thought would be, the core questions about having a flourishing culture kind of never change. And I would just like to ask everyone, if you think that we have a flourishing culture and if you think that we don't. And the idea would be that we need to start working on the problem. And I think right now it's hard because people sometimes ask me, can't you just replace generative AI? No. Like we don't know, we don't really have a clue, frankly, what would create the performance curves that are actually better than that tech, but it's carrying with it so much baggage that it's a danger to culture. So I would encourage people, I don't want to sound like I'm preaching, but read history, and every era, every generation has to ask these fundamental questions about how things should work for us. Like it's always humanism, right? Like we're always at the end of the day talking about what works for us in society. And that's just getting so obscured in a million different ways right now. It's concerning. So yeah, that's what I would say. I'm not sure I said that very well, but something, pointing towards what do we want for ourselves and how do we actually go about getting it would be the idea.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.